Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Fellows Colloquium series. Today, we're happy to welcome fellow David Bindman, a longtime friend of the Hutchins Center. He is Emeritus Durning-Lawrence Professor at the History of Art at University College London, a distinguished, wide-ranging scholar. He is the author of numerous books and catalogs, including the classics Blake as an Artist, Ape to Apollo, Aesthetics and the Idea of Race, 1700 to 1800, and Brubuliak and the 18th Century Monument, which was the winner of the 1996 Mitchell Prize. David Bindman is also the leading figure in the study of William Hogarth. His definitive Hogarth has just been republished in a revised edition. Here it is. And of course, he is also co-author with Henry Louis Gates Jr. of the 12-volume series, The Image of the Black in Western Art. Forthcoming are his co-edited volumes, The Image of the Black in Latin America and the Caribbean, William Blake and Europe, which is an exhibition catalog actually, written with Esther Chadwick, and Visualizing Human Difference, Art, Aesthetics, and Race in the 19th century. So please welcome David Bindman.
Right, thank you very much. I should just begin by saying that I gave a lecture in Philadelphia early in the year. I was introduced as a felon of the Hutchins Center. But anyway, I think I've been released from that. Now, once again, I must thank most warmly everybody at the Hutchins Center, which has been a home from home for me for 16 years. I've made numerous friends here since 2006, among fellows from so many countries, and especially among the people who work here under the benign presence of Skip Gates, whose openness to ideas and wide sympathies color all the fellows' experience here. Abby, Krishna, Velma, Sheldon, Karen, Tom, and others are a marvelously friendly and supportive team who make the center a vibrant and collegial place, as you all know. My paper today is about one of the most exciting research projects of my career, and it's one very much in progress. I should add that it is a team effort involving Catherine Hall, Esther Chadwick, the painting conservation teams at the Victoria and Albert Museum, and also at the Courtauld Institute, and our most recent recruit, the historian Professor Farah Daboy-Wala. In 1929, the Victoria and Albert Museum bought the painting of Francis Williams, which you see on the screen, was born circa 1690, died in 1762, from a Major Howard, who claimed that it descended to him through the Long family, plantation owners in Jamaica. The most famous member of the family, Edward, played a central part in the story of Williams and his afterlife, and he is best known for the immensely learned, comprehensive, and deeply racist History of Jamaica, 1774. Long is a highly important figure and the subject of a forthcoming book by Catherine Hall, because he provided the justification for plantation slavery based specifically on the racial inferiority of Africans, for whom he claimed slavery was a natural state. It is an astonishing thought that most of what we know of Williams, including his only surviving literary effort, come from a chapter devoted to him in Long's history, the purpose of which was to negate in detail the challenge that Williams' obvious intelligence and cultural competence offered to Long's racial theory. His need to assert Williams' cultural inferiority led him to give a sneering account of Williams' life that includes a very long extract from his only known poem in Latin, which he denigrates mercilessly line by line. The portrait was painted at some point between circa 1730 and 1760, and it is in every way unique in its period and context. It is the only portrait of a named Black person in the Caribbean before the last decade of the century. It is at least a decade earlier than any other representation of a Black individual in the West Indies, and it is the only one to have survived painted by an amateur rather than a professional artist, a point to which I will return. The person depicted is equally remarkable. Francis Williams was, almost uniquely in the 18th century Caribbean, a Black man of education and inherited wealth, and a slave owner himself. Michel Ronick has described him as a tertium quid, a third thing, combining two elements, which in the plantation society to which he belonged means those of master and slave. Furthermore, he and his family, because of his father's position in society, despite himself being descended from slaves, held the extraordinary privileges, by definition confined to white people, of a special Jamaican legislative act that gave him the right to a jury trial and prevented slaves from giving evidence against him. The father's status, as Professor Farah Daboyawala has discovered, was achieved through trading in textiles. They also seem to have provided financial services to plantation owners. None of these privileges and education in London earned Francis respect from his white compatriots in Jamaica, the richest of the British colonies in the Americas, which has been described as one of the most factious and unruly colonies in the empire, always fearful of slave and maroon uprisings and invasion from other European powers. The painting belongs to the period before that that Vince Brown described in his colloquium in February of Tacky's revolt that put the Jamaican planters under unprecedented threat to their plantations. Williams was also notable for his mathematical and literary ambitions. The former is clear from the fact that he was put forward for membership of the Royal Society by its president, and though he was turned down for it, he was evidently interviewed by a committee on which Sir Isaac Newton sat. An article of May 1771, just a few years after his death, states that Mr. Williams, an African of fortune, who dressed like a gentleman in a tie wig, sword, etc., and who was honored with the friendship of Mr. Cheselden, the great surgeon, and other men of science, was admitted to the meetings of the Royal Society, and being proposed as a member, was rejected solely for a reason unworthy of that learned body, viz. On account of his complexion. After returning to Jamaica in 1723 on his father's death, he offered odes to incoming governors of Jamaica, only one of which has survived in the pages of Long's History of Jamaica. Long's chapter on him is a relentless and fine-grained demolition of William's claim to recognition as a Latin poet, for his literary ability was a direct challenge to Long's own claim that Blacks were destined by nature to be nothing more than slaves. Long himself was a judge and a largely absentee planter who became the chief spokesman for the other owners of large Jamaican sugar estates, some of whom were notorious for their callousness towards their slaves. An educated Black man with gentlemanly accomplishments, superior to most of his white counterparts, was, as Long saw it, a challenge to the basis of Jamaican society and its dependence on slave labor. Long's picture of Williams is one of withering contempt and sarcasm, and Williams' Latin address in elegiac couplets to the incoming and short-lived Governor George Haldane in 1759 is reproduced, translated, and annotated by Long with tendentious notes that attest to his own learning. Long's contempt was entirely misplaced, as Locksley Lindo has demonstrated. Williams's use of metre skillfully combines Catullin and Ovidian forms of couplet with a break from the latter when he addresses the question of his own blackness, arguing movingly that art and humanity recognize no distinctions of skin color. I quote, "Established by a powerful hand, for the creating God gave the same soul to all living beings, nothing forbidding. Virtue itself has no color, nor does wisdom. There is no color in the pure mind, none in art." This deeply, if conventionally learned man was born in Jamaica, but educated in England, as he put it himself, insula me genuit, celebres alluere Britanni. An island bore me, famous Britons nourished me. Though he appears not to have studied at Cambridge as Long claims. The one certainty, apart from his attempts to join the Royal Society, is that he was admitted as a member of Lincoln's Inn in August 1721 and returned to Jamaica following his father's death in July 1723, inheriting with his siblings his father's considerable estate, which included slaves and many debts for money lending. And what I'm hoping will eventually turn up is his sale catalogue, which does seem to have been known to have existed but has not been seen. William's wealth and property should have entitled him to a seat on the Governor's Council or the Assembly, but this was blocked by Edward Trelawney, who was governor from 1736 to 52, and who had famously brought the Maroon War to an end by a treaty with Cudjoe, the Maroon leader. Williams was then, as the Reverend John Lindsay put it, reduced to keeping of a Negro school in Spanish Town, and it's in this role that he is depicted in the portrait, though the number and social standing of his pupils is unknown. Spanish Town was the seat of the governor and was the planters' capital, as opposed to the merchant town of Kingston. But the planters were almost always in conflict with the governor, as they were in all colonies. So William's address to him would have made the writer even more of an object of disdain to planters. Now let's turn to the portrait. It is meticulously detailed and would have taken a long time to complete. It follows on or parallels a type of fashionable portrait of the gentleman author, as in David Lemarchand's Ivory of the young author Matthew Raper, made a few years before, or the slightly provincial portraits of Arthur Devis, like this one, of an unknown gentleman in his library. The furniture, I'll come back to that. The furniture is represented with such precision that it was for its contribution to furniture studies that the painting was purchased by the Victorian Albert Museum in 1928. The book that lies open is identified as Newton's Philosophy, presumably Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, first printed 1687, and several of the books on the shelf behind him, and the shelves behind him are identified. And you've got copies of Newton, Locke, and less clearly Cowley, Sherlock, and Rapin. Williams appears to be in the act of teaching a pupil or pupils who would notionally be in the position of the spectator of the painting itself. His hand is on an open copy of Newton, while he gestures with his other hand towards a celestial globe on his desk, which is paired with a terrestrial globe on the floor near his feet. He's evidently teaching Newton's theory of gravity, demonstrating that it is the force that unites the movement of the planets with the physical world beneath. The books in the background, at least the ones we can decipher, suggest the intellectual range of an educated and rather conservative English gentleman of the period. The books that frame his head and upper body figuratively represent the contents of his mind and his experience of the world in the Lockean sense of someone who comes into the world without preconceptions. They show him to be an Orthodox Anglican and a believer in natural religion, signified by a volume of the writings of the Bishop of London, Thomas Sherlock, who proclaimed, as did the other bishops of the Church of England, that the world and nature were the providential gifts to mankind of a benevolent but distant creator. The rational nature of his religious beliefs and his regard for education are signified by his possession of a book by Locke, his interest in British history by a book by Paul de Rapin de Thoiras, the French author of a famous history of England in 10 volumes, published in French, 1724 to 27. The book by Abraham Cowley, the 17th century royalist poet, proclaims his devotion to the British monarchy and his refined taste. Edward Long, in his attempt to denigrate William's claim to learning, describes him as, I quote, affecting a singularity of dress and particularly grave cast of countenance to impress an idea of his wisdom and learning. And to second this view, he wore in common a huge wig which made a venerable figure. Though tendentiously phrased, this account of William's appearance broadly corresponds to the figure of Williams in the painting itself. This may not be a coincidence because the painting was acquired in 1928 from Major Howard, who claimed to be, I quote, a direct descendant through his mother of Long, the author of the History of Jamaica. So it is probable that Edward Long either owned the painting or had seen it in a family collection. Now, who painted the portrait? Until now, none of those who have written on the portrait have made an attribution, except to assume that it was an artist native to Jamaica of less than professional accomplishment. The general flatness of the figure, the spindly legs, and the shapeless hands make it clear that it is the work of an amateur rather than a trained portrait painter. The full-length figure in a small format with close attention to the setting and the furniture bears a resemblance to more professionally competent paintings by Arthur Davis, and I show one on the screen, the Lancashire-born portraitist who set up a studio in London in 1737. That's to say after Williams left London. It's this portrait by him of an unknown man in the Yale Centre for British Art also shows a bewigged gentleman displaying his cultivation in his meticulously depicted library, though at leisure rather than teaching. So given that Williams left London for Jamaica in 1723, it is unlikely that Williams knew of Davis unless he went on an unrecorded visit to London at a later period. But there may be common sources in 17th century full-length portraits like those of Hendrik Gerrit's Potts. And I show here a rather surprising portrait of Charles I, showing him as he was, in fact, a small man and not the sort of grand figure on horseback painted by Van Dyck. And of course, notice that it has a relatively plain floor, as does the Davis, but sometimes you get checkerboard floors in these paintings. But the one real distinction of the Williams portrait, and it is an important one, is that it's based on a carefully worked out perspective that gives a clear sense of space to the work. No painter of the Williams portrait has ever been suggested by name. No other paintings have been attributed to the same hand, and no likely artists are recorded in Jamaica before Williams' death in 1762. In any case, the painter as an amateur would probably not have been recognized as an artist. It occurred to me after looking at the painting for many years and even writing about it, that the attribution might be literally staring me in the face, that the author must be no other than Williams himself. Can I prove it? No, but in my view, everything in the painting points to it being actually painted by him, not least its mathematical elements. In the first place, the meticulous nature of the painting suggests that a person with an intimate knowledge of Williams' mind was involved in every detail, from the terrestrial and celestial globes to the furniture and the books behind. Even if the painting were painted by somebody else, Williams would have had to direct every brushstroke over a long period of time. And I will argue that a well-educated man with mathematical aptitude, like Williams, was not only capable of painting the picture, but it would have been another way for him to assert the range of his achievements. For in the early 18th century, perspective devices were of enormous interest to mathematicians. The painting, furthermore, is entirely compatible with the self-reflective passages in his sole surviving poem. Though he is dressed in the full formal garb, including wig of an English gentleman, he is represented as a dark-skinned man, yet showing an absolute mastery of the accomplishments associated with the former, and au courant with the latest metropolitan thought, while also a man of scientific prowess. The portrait expresses in visual form, among other things, the sense of the passage he addresses to himself in the poem to George Haldane. Nor let it be a source of shame to you that you bear a white body in a black skin. Worth of character more befits a Bois and fire of intellect and an attractive beauty in a learned mouth. Rather a wise heart, love of country and virtue, separate him from his fellows and make him distinguished. Secondly, there's an indication that the painter of the portrait had studied techniques of painting from books or prints, copied from paintings. The painter has clearly mastered perspective to achieve a convincing sense of depth and recession through the checkered floor and the angle of furniture and globes. So it leaves the question, where would he have been able to learn about perspective? Well, the answer is that there are literally dozens of books produced in the early 18th century in London, some predominantly mathematical, others adapted from them, and basic books of instruction for painters and allied trades, which again very often had instruction on perspective. By the time he left London in 1723, he would have had many to choose from, and I would guess more than one formed part of the library he brought over with him back to Jamaica. Apart from the painter's instruction books, at least 3 books that discuss perspective from an optical and mathematical point of view, made so fashionable by Isaac Newton, were published in the years before Williams went to London. Bernard Lamy, A Treatise on Perspective, 1702, John Shuttleworth, A Treatise of Optics Direct, 1709, and the Newtonian mathematician Humphrey Ditton, A Treatise of Perspective, Demonstrative and Practical, of 1712. Though Williams, as a Newtonian and mathematics teacher, would have been interested in all 3, the work of Ditton would, as its title suggests, have been of most practical use to an intending painter of his mathematical bent, though it's not in any way about painting itself. I can't, you'll forgive me for this, but I can't resist quoting the chorus of a scurrilous poem by Jonathan Swift, ridiculing Ditton and his colleague Whiston's attempt at solving the problem of longitude. And I thought I'd heard of Ditton before I embarked on this one. So Ditton and Whiston may both be pissed on, and Whiston and Ditton may both be shit on. If we look at the painting, we can see that the illusion of depth depends on the spectator's gaze being at eye level with William's own. While the checkered floor creates a recession based on convergence to a vanishing point located in William's face. And I don't know if you can see this very clearly on the image, but you can see the lines. I've continued rather crudely the lines from the checkerboard floor, and you notice that they all converge somewhere in his face. And I suspect if I did it more accurately and had the painting in front of me, they would actually all converge pretty much between his eyes or around his forehead. But in any case, they all reach up there. Can you see that?
Yes, we can.
Good, great. This could have been indebted to the ideas behind the diagram, which is on the second left on plate 3 of Ditton's treatise, in which O is the spectator and Q to X is the plane represented by the canvas and the transition from the real space inhabited by the observer into the virtual space represented in the painting. In plate 4, the diagram to the left shows how to achieve the illusion of recession from a series of equal-sized plinths corresponding to the recession of the seat of the chair in the painting. I'll go back to that. It shows that a template of one of the most difficult requirements of realist painting was available to amateurs in an intellectual context that goes back to the early Italian Renaissance and was given prominence again by Newton's discoveries in optics. The structure of the painting itself then adds more to the intellectual aura of the subject and would have seemed a worthy task for a man of a mathematical bent like Williams. So the portrait, far from just being an imitation of a more sophisticated type of portrait, is itself an open demonstration of the author's mathematical prowess. The ingenuity with which the teaching of Newton is displayed through the open book and the two globes, the application of mathematical perspective, and the way in which the books are used demonstrate the range of his mind and suggests an author of the sophistication and learning that we know Williams to have possessed. I would argue that there's no need to bring in another painter to account for the painting. In other words, the painting as a self-portrait is a default position rather than one requiring an elaborate explanation. And again, in that sense, it's very much like many other attribution problems that an art historian has to deal with, really. I mean, like the recent Leonardo portrait of Christ, which is, a Leonardo, but it's not 100% certain that he ever put his brush to work on the canvas. It was Miss Williams' posthumous misfortune to have his life story recorded for posterity by a man who was concerned solely to denigrate him. It also gives a special poignancy to the painting, which was clearly designed by Williams to counter the attitudes of his own white contemporaries in Jamaica, who shared Long's beliefs. It is true that Williams inherited slaves and defined his own prowess entirely in terms of British cultural values, but there's also evidence from what survives of his writing and the painting of an extraordinary, even heroic determination to be recognized for his true mathematical and literary gifts in the face of prejudice based on his skin color. I've put the case as best I can for attributing the paintings to Williams itself, but the inquiry is not complete. The conservators in the working group I mentioned at the beginning will submit the painting to a barrage of tests using advanced technology that will look beneath the surface of the painting and analyze the pigments used. What might we find? Of course, one never knows at this stage, but we might get an insight into earlier stages of the painting's formation and a possible underdrawing that reveals a laying in of the perspective lines. And I would hope to be able to decipher the titles of more of the books in the library at the back. There are also other lines of inquiry that might produce exciting results: the analysis of the pigments in the painting, and especially the clothing and the tie wig which Williams is wearing, which should be a clue to, well, either the dating, if not of the painting, at least of his clothes. Professor Daboiwala is also researching Williams' network of contacts in early 18th century London, which seemed to be much more extensive than anyone had realized. Though Williams lived a life of relative obscurity in Jamaica, Long's hostile views of him are very likely behind David Hume's notorious footnote in Of National Characters of 1754, in which he claims to suspect the Negroes to be naturally inferior to the whites on the grounds that there scarcely ever was a civilized nation of that complexion, nor even an individual eminent either in action or speculation. No ingenious manufactures among them, no arts, no sciences, a theme that was later taken up from the same source by Kant. It is a tragedy that it has taken more than 250 years to reveal the striking accomplishments of Francis Williams that totally undermine Long's tendentious and highly influential account of him. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. It's marvelous. It just gets better and better. As you know, I'm so fascinated with Francis Williams. Dwight, when David, we introduced you that when I was completing my PhD dissertation, which has a long chapter on Edward Long on Francis Williams, Dwight was praying me to the finish line at the Black Church at Yale every Sunday. And I would go in with great trepidation and listen to Dwight's sermons, and then the whole congregation would form a circle. We'd cross hands and sing, "We've come this far by faith, leaning on the Lord." And I'd have tears in my eyes. I'd say, "I've come with Francis Williams this far by faith. Lord, help me. Please, please get me to the finish line. Don't let Edward Long stop me." But I've, the American Academy is conferring this Don Randall Award. And I wrote an essay about the arts and sciences that I was going to read as a speech. And then they decided that I would do a conversation with David Rubenstein next Friday, which is a lot easier, but I'd already written the essay. So, and they just told me this morning they're going to publish it. And in it, I end with Samuel Jennings' 1792 Liberty Displaying the Arts and Sciences. And I wish that we had, we could juxtapose it with this painting of Francis Williams, because it reverses the tropes. I mean, whether wittingly or unwittingly, the globe, the book, the subject, of course, is not a Black man, it's a white female liberty. The open window with, Black enslaved people cavorting outside in the distance. Has that ever occurred to you? I'm juxtaposing the two at the very end of because I've beaten on Hume and Kant for 30 years, about those quotes, as you know. But I thought it occurred to me that how similar the two paintings are, but in reverse, and some 70 years apart. Or when do you date this painting? Oh no, this is 1730.
No, it's probably 1750s, I should think. Would be
40 years apart. There's Samuel Jennings in Philadelphia, but the tropes are reversed, even the globe, right? So I just wonder if you'd ever thought about reading them against each other.
Well, I hadn't, but I can see the point of doing that, yes. Because, what's so fascinating, this is so early, this painting. The Francis Williams, it precedes almost everything of this kind altogether. But again, it's also in a sort of way, you could say it's using the same kind of equipment, the globes and the imagery, but as you say, turning it around completely, but not necessarily with ill intent, but still, it in a sense presupposes that someone like Francis Williams couldn't have existed.
Yes, it does. And is there any way we could get that slide up, Krishna, outside of David's PowerPoint or not?
We're trying to. Thank you.
It's called Liberty Displaying the Arts and Sciences by Samuel Jennings. It's
in volume 3, 3, I think. What I can try and do is show it.
It's in Wikipedia. You could just Google it. Tom, can you find it?
We have found it. We're trying to figure out how to show it.
It's in the chat. We just shared it through the chat.
Oh, okay.
Well,
please see the link.
So how can we all look at it at the same time? Tom?
That's a little more complicated. I can look into that.
Okay. We don't have to. I don't want to create a diversion, but it is quite fascinating because I've just been, a few months ago, I looked at it again because basically in that thesis, I'm tracing the trope of the arts and sciences and their absence and presence as manifested in writing to talk about the humanity of Black people. So Edward Long is very, very important to that. He even has kind of aesthetic principles by which to judge the writings of Black people.
Yeah.
And then they were destined to come up short no matter what. But he said, look, we have to be rigorous and scrutinize. Tim Weiskell says, he has it on his screen, Krishna, can you enable him to be, I don't know, this is all too complicated for me. But Tim says, I have it on my screen. If you enable me to share screen, I can project it on Zoom. Okay.
Here, I'll share it from my screen. The problem is, David, this is going to take down your slide, but we'll just do that for a moment.
Okay.
Yeah, we can flip back and forth.
Yeah, okay. Oh, yes,
Yeah.
right. Yeah, yes.
You see what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. It does. Yes, it's a sort of general 18th century pictorial language, isn't it? But it also, what's really interesting is that in some ways the figure of Liberty or whatever she is quite equivalent to the figure of Francis Williams in the painting again.
Yes, that's my point. It's troping, and there's even an open. It's not a window, but it's an open door.
Yeah, and the globe, of course. Yes.
Yeah, and the globe, and it's called Liberty Displaying the Arts and Sciences. And whether intentional or not, it does reverse it tropes. It's signifying on Williams. They have these two paintings have a signifying relationship. There's no doubt about that.
But also the checkerboard floor, which is again the perspective, is then part of that troping as well.
Yeah. Yeah, there you go. So you see, not bad for a literary critic there, David, huh?
Yeah.
I've learned something after editing 11 volumes with you, right?
Right. So have I certainly. Yeah. Okay, shall we go back to?
Yeah, let's go back to your PowerPoint. Okay, questions, comments, everyone.
Paul Kaplan, would you like to speak?
Start my video here. Hi, David. That was
Hi.
great. Fantastic to learn so much more about this absolutely fascinating work. I have a question and a comment. I'll give you my comment first. The perspective construction of the window does not work with the floor at all. And for someone really knowledgeable about perspective, that would be an obvious flaw. I think you're absolutely right that the orthogonals go to his mind. I think that's got to be deliberate, but the window doesn't have the same point of view, and the orthogonals don't move toward the same vanishing point.
Yeah.
So I think that's something that you'll need to integrate. Let me just give you my question, and you can respond to both. The question is, what do we see on the terrestrial globe? What faces the viewer? Is that discernible? Anyway, thanks for a brilliant talk.
Again, I need to go back and that's something that'll, I think, come out when we get to the next stage of really looking at the painting in detail, because up till now it's been on display in the V&A. And of course, I think it's now come down and been sent to the lab. And at that point, we will be able to, get it with all the lights, magnifying glasses and X-rays. And I think we'll really be able to not only see the globes, but also to see how much of the text of Newton he's able to tell us in the book on the table. So I think that's very much a question for the next stage. As for the question on perspective, yes, of course. I mean, it represents a different space, and he would have done the perspective for that one, in a different way. So it's not systematically joined up perspective all the way through the painting. But the main thing is that his figure is part of the perspective. And of course, the other thing about it, which I forgot to mention, is that if one of the lines of the perspective goes through the pen on the desk and lines up from the floor to his head. So all of that is done methodically, but I think he just regards the exterior as a separate space. And I think that's probably true of other paintings in which this kind of checkerboard floor is used. Hello?
Yes, thank you. Farah Dablvala.
Thank you. Can you hear me, David?
Yes, I can, yes.
Well, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. I had two quick questions. One follows on from what Paul Kaplan just said. And I wasn't thinking about the window, but it's curious that the bookcase is at such a funny slant. And I was wondering if you had thoughts on that. But before you answer, I'm completely persuaded by the perspectival points you made, and I thought that's brilliant, just linking it with the Ditton as well. I had shivers when you showed that slide. And no one has ever previously said that the checkerboard is there for that reason. Everyone is obsessed with it being black and white and he being black and white and so on. But I think this is a wonderful breakthrough. So the bookcase at a slant is weird. On the globe, I think it shows, by the way, Jamaica. It shows the West Indies. So there's a meaning to the terrestrial image that we're seeing there. My other question is paints. If an amateur has done this, if Francis William himself has done it, how easy is it? Would you make your own paints? Can you acquire paints? How's the practicality of this work?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because there is an answer. There is in one of the articles, I can't remember by whom, it does mention that there is some sort of inventory of of a general store in Spanish Town, which apparently did stock paints, and also had a selection of paintings for sale as well. But it did apparently have paints for sale. And I can't remember offhand how detailed it was, but there was a clear source where he could have got them. But of course, when we've actually finally examined and analyzed the paints, it would be really interesting to see whether we can get any correlation between those and the ones that were on sale, or whether it also reveals that there were some that he might have made himself. Of course, I mean, this was an age where painters often did make their own colors. But again, that's exactly the kind of question we can probably give a much better answer to at the next stage of the inquiry.
Thank you.
Zoe Taylor.
Hi, David. Thank you for presenting today. I'm an art history major at Wellesley, so it's been really nice I'm on spring break right now, so it's been nice to get back into art history. I took a class with a professor who also does the arts magazine for the Hutchins Center, Dr. Nikki Green. And she showed us, she showed us the Phyllis Wheatley portrait by Scipio Moorhead. And it really reminds me of, in the Frances Williams portrait, how there's a book and there's an emphasis on like literacy and like documentation. What do you, I know you touched on this a little bit, but what do you make of that like significance and the reference to like literacy and being able to read or write?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and I think the connection between the two is absolutely fascinating. In fact, if there's anything that, gives a sort of visual context to the painting, it would be the Phyllis Wheatley. First of all, the Phyllis Wheatley is really using what are by then quite conventional tropes of the author portrait. And if you go to the National Portrait Gallery in London, you'll see that there are a great many portraits of famous writers that have, often sort of looking thoughtful, a book, and sometimes in the act of writing, but also seemingly getting heavenly inspiration at the same time. And that, I think, may be implicit with Phyllis Wheatley, but not, I think, with Frances Williams, which would be interesting difference. But the Phyllis Wheatley is again, I think, an almost exact equivalent in a slightly different period, rather later, but not that much later, of the continuity of these tropes of the writer in his, well, I suppose you could say that the Frances Williams is more showing himself as a sort of teacher and also as a scientist as well, but it's very much the same world. And of course, in these painters tended to reach for whatever was available, and globes are very familiar things. Books, of course, yes. And of course, the implication is that Phyllis Wheatley is writing her own, the poems that are in the volume. So it's a very active kind of reading that she's doing, or even probably really raw thinking about her own writing. So yes, I think that connection. And of course, Scipio Moorhead is a fascinating figure. If only we knew more about him. If you know more than I do, I'd love to talk to you about that. But he is really, really interesting because he's someone who has an identity as an artist extremely early, really, in the 1770s. Yeah, so thank you for that.
He's one of my distant ancestors, David. That's where the skip comes from. And Dwight was taking me seriously too. Yeah, I did his DNA, Dwight. But we think, do we think, David, that engraving was from a painting that he did or not?
Well, it must have been a drawing, probably. But I think yes, Scipio Moorhead must have. I mean, the engraving was made in London, and it's possible that she brought it over with her and then had it engraved. But it must have existed in. I mean, I don't think it would necessarily have been a painting.
Okay, but the drawing, but it could have been a painting. Is that right?
It could have been a painting, yes, or it could have been a drawing was meant to be engraved. That was a normal way of doing it. Yes.
But that's been lost.
Lost. Yes. There's no.
That's another thing to put on our bucket list to find.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that and Francis Williams' sale catalogue. Yeah.
Yeah, but David, tell her about the image that Equiano uses in 1789.
What in the volume? Well,
yeah, in his autobiography.
In the autobiography, yes. Got a copy of it here. We'll get it down. Yeah. This one, yes. Can that be seen? Yes. Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, what's interesting is that he is, I mean, dressed as a gentleman, but he's also got a volume in front of him, which reads Acts.
Precisely. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, I mean, again, it's sort of gentlemanly, because it's not so much a writer's portrait, I would have thought, as more a man in public life. But it's again, I don't think was done by a white artist, as far as I know, and engraved. And there is a portrait in Exeter, which is much more formal, that's sometimes thought to be of Equiano, but to my mind, it doesn't look like him at all.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that controversy, but it's fascinating, though.
Yes, it is. Yes.
I mean, nobody, they attribute that painting. They say it's of Equiano, but it doesn't look like him, right? So we don't know. So we don't know who the hell that black guy is. He's pretty good looking, and it's a great painting, you know.
Yeah, no.
But anyway, this becomes a conceit, almost a trope, a convention of representing black people as inscribing themselves, because they've inscribed themselves literally and figuratively. They're inscribing themselves by writing a book, and then there's an image of replicating the process visually, as it were, in one way or another. Yes. I can read and I can write, or I can write, or I can read, depending.
Yes, and I think just suggests he has opinions worth listening to, because he's, presenting as a gentleman. Yes.
I think Zoe has a follow-up question.
Yes, sure.
Just a follow-up. Yeah, I think the Moorhead, I don't have too much information on it, as I learned it like 2 years ago before the pandemic, but I'm taking a decolonial art history class, which is really interesting. We're reading Walter Mignolo, a lot of contemporary artists, where we talk about kind of the writing of history and historization and dehistorizing, and that kind of approach to art history, even thinking about like Benin bronzes and repatriation. So even thinking about like Scipio Moorhead and how we don't have a lot of like history or literature behind him, I think that just goes to show this idea of historization and colonialism within the art history canon.
Yeah, oh sure, yes, no doubt about it. I mean, that's why I'm so thrilled to be able to, in a sense, if not complete, at least add to the identity of Francis Williams, because there's so few who somehow are able to get through what you're talking about and have a clearly identifiable identity, personality, voice, really, of their own. And that's what's so extraordinary about him, that, almost against impossible odds, he does have a voice of his own and personality and achievements as well. And he's really a fully rounded person through the things that we know about him. And again, that's so rare. And to have also an image of him, see what he looked like, one that he's created himself, is an extraordinary. I mean, it's hard to think of many other examples that early of someone who has such a clear sort of sense of self. And there are not many. I mean, it takes some years before others come along. Of course, Ignatius Sancho is a good case in point. But you know, Williams is earlier than these people, and that's what's so extraordinary.
Thank you. Ting Chang.
Okay.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Ting. Yes.
Oh, here, the camera. Hello, thank
there
you
you
so
are,
much,
right.
David.
I see you.
Yes, thank you. Let me lower my hand. I think that's gone. Thank you so much. That was great. And the previous speaker kind of set up my question, which is about the decolonial or pre-post-colonial. I was completely convinced by your argument and interpretation. I don't have any objections to it, but I just wondered how can we think about this so that it's not, you know, how can we get out of that closed loop of colonialism whereby this Black man is inscribing himself with all the accoutrements of European learning in the clothing and wig and, you know, general self-presentation of European learning. How can we get beyond that to some other form of discourse or some other form of presentation or manifestation? I'm just thinking of some, you know, non-chronological or totally ahistorical reading against the grain, even if it was impossible at the time. Is there some other kind of decolonial or pre-post-colonial reading? That's my question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting question and a difficult one, really, because he does. I mean, he does also adopt some of the, you know, I mean, he does own slaves. I mean, let's be blunt about it. And of course, it's also true of Phyllis Wheatley, that Phyllis Wheatley, I think in some ways was someone that needed Skip to, you know, bring her back to life in a way, because she was so inscribed within the colonial culture. And that's certainly true of Williams, there's no doubt about it. I mean, he says quite openly that he is, but I think that perhaps we need to think in some idea of hybridity, really. I think in a way you can't expect someone of the 18th century to be able to get out of that kind of thing very easily. And, you know, he's in a way locked into that society, whether he likes it or not. And he is very concerned to show, in a sense, to show that he can achieve all these things within this society. And I think that what I think one can't do is expect him to, you know, be someone who, say, was in favor of Taki's revolt. I mean, he is on the other side for all sorts of reasons, mainly financial, I suppose. He's got money and power. So he is, and I think that it's often these people like Francis Williams are in a tragic situation. I mean, they are forced to, well, make their peace with what they also feel is something that's alien and treating them badly. So I think it's, I've got no obvious solution to talking about people like this in a way that's going to be post-colonial. I think you've just got to also be sympathetic to them and be aware of the power of the society around them to force them into certain molds. And in a way, I mean, you could argue that, that Francis Williams you know, really does stand up for himself in a very striking way. But he does it in terms that still of the ascended ethos, really. And I don't know if there's any way out for him at that time, or really for anybody. Certainly not for Ignatius Sancho. I mean, who again, I mean, rather intriguingly, that Ignatius Sancho, I mean, when I was working on the image of the black, there was the looking at shop cards and tobacco advertisements, which almost always show these grotesquely embarrassing scenes in the Caribbean of, you know, young boys serving white masters, so on. And the fascinating thing was that Ignatius Sancho's shop card also uses those tropes as well. So he's also, in a way, caught up in this colonial ideas, whether he likes it or not. Sorry, I've got no straight answer to that, but anyway.
Kristen, does Tim Weiskel have questions?
Yes, he does. There is someone else ahead in queue.
Oh, okay. I just didn't want to miss it. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Jenny Gaski, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name.
Hello. No, not at all. I just lower my hand. I work at the V&A as the senior curator for paintings and drawings, and I missed the first 2 minutes of David's presentation. I have to apologize. And I just wanted to say how excited we are here at the museum to be part of the project. And I just wanted to, if you'd like to, give you an update. The painting is still in the conservation studio, but a lot of the initial work has been done. So the hyperspectral imaging has been done, the XRF mapping and the X-radiography have been done, the infrared rectography has been done. And the only thing we're still working on this level is the high resolution digital imaging. So we can't wait to sort of hear about the interpretation of those findings and to get everyone together for the next stage. And I mean, this is maybe also slightly picking up on what Ting was saying. We're very keen to display the work differently once the work is done and with greater prominence, and to highlight what the research has brought out. So I just wanted to sort of say thank you so much for your talk, David. And I just wanted to say we're obviously very committed as well, just in case that wasn't already clear. And to give you an update, David, it's still in the studio. And yeah, I think especially the high resolution imaging might help with some of the questions you talked about, especially the book covers and all of that. Thank you.
Oh, that's really terrific. Yes. Well, I'm thrilled to hear that, and can't wait to get into see what you've discovered. Yes.
Thank you. Tim.
Hello, David. We haven't seen each other in a while, but this fantastic presentation, I think there's a lot of material that we talked about, you and me and Karen talked about earlier on, about images that appear at this time in the cartouche of maps. And in fact, the kind of imagery that Skip brought up about the portraiture of liberty and the like is commonplace in the frontispieces of atlases and encyclopedia at the time. And it would be very interesting to put those in an array of things to look at as tropes, as the way Skip started to refer to them, as visual tropes of one kind or another, because there's a kind of dictionary of material out there for printmakers, not especially for artists that are working in oils or various colored paintings, but for printmakers. And printmakers refer to them and copy each other quite lavishly and without attribution. So it takes a lot of art historians' work on this as well. But there might be a phase in which it's important to realize that imagery of the 16th and 17th century and early 18th century is very different than the imagery that starts to emerge just about the time you're talking about. In other words, there's a real breaking point where dignity is lost, where the royal is not presented, where blacks systematically become slaves. But there's a whole period before that when that isn't the case. And it would be very useful, it seems to me, to identify that art historically, where that breaking point is. It's a mistake for us to think that what came before the 19th century was really just a more primitive representation of the racism that we see in the 19th century, because there's a whole period of what might be called the royal trade in which a great deal of dignity is granted to African figures in these tropes, in the cartouche of all these maps. We're looking at some of this now in reference to the Congo because of an exhibit that's coming up at the Medici Gallery in Italy. We've been approached by a Congolese scholar who is himself an artist, who's trying to, in effect, recall the images that were used for the Mani-Congo. The Mani-Congo was the early representation of the Congo kingdom with a K. And these images show up very interestingly on early maps, and in fact have been adopted by some recent authors as cover material for Nzinga, for example. The biography of Nzinga takes as the cover an engraving from an 18th century presentation of her. I'd be glad to get together with you whenever we're on the same continent. I doubt if we are at this point. Are you in London? But in any case, we can correspond, and I can send you some links for this, because there's now a group that's dedicated to looking at the maps, the 17th, 18th, 19th century maps, and tracing this transformation of the imagery in maps from the earlier stereotypes, but might be called royal tropes, toward the slavery tropes, largely as a result of the West Indian influence. Now that in itself, it seems to me, is fascinating and ought to be investigated. As you know, up at Oxford, there's a big brouhaha these days about decolonizing this and that and the other thing. And they've started with the Rhodes Trust itself, which doesn't have a whole lot to decolonize except the manuscripts, not the imagery. But the imagery is present in basically all of the Oxford colleges. And the Codrington Library, as you know, at Oxford has just been renamed because Codrington was a very famous Barbadian slaveholder. And his big wealthy gift to All Souls College in Oxford, the most prestigious college in Oxford, was his library from Barbados. And they've in fact changed the name of the library. It's no longer the Codrington Library, it's the All Souls Library, but they've kept the statue of Codrington himself as carved in white marble in the center of this library. Every one of the Oxford libraries is going through their treasure trove at this point. The one I worked in Balliol, just held a fantastic exhibit of that material, including the West Indian material. And there you find the representation of particularly the French material. This is very interesting because there was a link in the 18th century between Balliol and the French. And there is a great deal of literature about the revolution of Toussaint de Louverture and its success. Plus the images of him that were drawn at the time. It would be something that I think Vince would be interested in as well, because there was a great deal of information circulated on other islands in the Caribbean at the time about the success of the Haitian Revolution. And a lot of that was visual imagery, that is, sketches. So I'll send along some links to you if you're interested, but I think this would be an interesting avenue to pursue. The print, map, and sketch literature that exists in many cases in the Oxford libraries as hand sketches that are not yet printed. They're pre-print in some sense. That is, they existed because people drew them back to their college mates or gave them in their bequests of the estate to such and such. Anyway, a lot of this might be of interest, especially because the master of Balliol now is Dame Helen Gosh. She used to be head, before she became master, the first woman master of Balliol College. She used to be head of the National Trust. And she knows basically every private library in the estates around England, and is beginning to work with the Bodleian to digitize some of this material. So
Maybe
let's keep in touch.
Yes, yeah, fine, thanks. Yeah, I mean, to take the point about print culture, yes, I completely agree with that. But what's interesting is a lot of these tropes do cross over, and for instance, the globe seems to be one that has many different meanings. And I think that, I mean, you get, as you rightly say, that lots of images, particularly of Africa or life in Africa, around the maps of Africa, and well, from the 16th century onwards. And I've got a very small snippet about those in the Image of the Black in the 18th century volume. They tend, on the whole, to be more about Africa. But to take up the point you make about slavery, I mean, I'm not sure there's a break between the imagery, but you do, of course, get throughout all of this, even through the period of slavery, images of the Black Magus, who is, of course, the Grand King of a wealthy country in Africa. And he is always shown with, well, extremely dignified, very well dressed, often with a long retinue of servants, sometimes camels in his retinue, and so on. So I think what you've really got are slightly different traditions running parallel with each other, but sometimes crossing over. And I think there are things like globes and that do seem to come in and cross over into different realms. But I think it's all in a way down to what Skip was saying at the beginning about really about conventions, how artists and painters and map makers are all very much bound by conventions, and these have a life that goes beyond, you know, whatever is topical at the time. And, you know, tropes like the author sitting there receiving inspiration. Again, that goes, you know, back and into the 17th century, at least, and continues with the end of the 18th century. So I would see it more as series of different discourses running parallel that sometimes interconnect rather than being a break between, you know, one and another. But you know, that's something we can talk about. Yeah.
Sure, and I think the coming exhibit in the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence may be of use in this respect, because what they've done is go back through the early maps that Lorenzo de' Medici had of Africa. And they're making a census of this in such a way that they're trying to account for the Zairian ivories that showed up in the collection of the Medici family at the end of the 15th century.
Yeah.
Anyway, that art is another aspect of this to pursue, but it's showing up as well in the tropes on the maps, because ivory is represented, as you know, again and again in the pictorial depiction of what is quintessentially African.
Yeah, that's true. Yes. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you. Rita?
David, thank you. You always amaze me with your breadth of knowledge and all the light you shed on something that's seemingly so straightforward. My question is really very pedestrian, I'm afraid. Looking at that painting, I'm struck by how sophisticated the library, the furniture, even details of the clothing are, versus the non-existent hands and spindly legs. And I had a question that's really far out, and maybe the technical analyses will have already answered this, but is it possible that some other artists did the background, if you will, and Williams himself painted his own face and perhaps legs and hands onto this? Is that, I'm reminded of the sort of stock photos of 18th century, or not photos, paintings of 18th century Boston, where regardless of who you are, you could pick your garment and just be painted in that. So I just thought I'd throw that out.
Well, I mean, anything, I mean, it's always possible. I mean, the real truth is we know nothing at least about his environment at that time. I think that, I mean, I see it as all, in a way, all of a piece, because he wouldn't, you know, he's not a trained painter. He's not even an experienced painter, not even clear he did any other paintings. So he would have, the figure is always the most difficult thing. And I would have thought that, you know, doing the books, I mean, he's obviously also someone who's quite an obsessive as well, I should think. And I could see an obsessive character doing the books, you know, spending, you know, doing 2 or 3 a day over a year or two. And then, of course, when it came to the body, I mean, he's not, first of all, he's not as interested in that as expressing his mathematical self, as it were. So that would have been secondary. And I suspect he just did what he could. But of course, you know, we don't really know. I fully accept that he may have had some friend, but I don't think that it was necessarily a professional artist needed to do the books. I mean, I'm not sure I see the incompatibility, if you like, between the two. But you know, it is always perfectly possible. Yes. Anyway, thanks for Rita.
Thank you. Nicole?
Hi, thank you. This was great. I had 2 questions. One is, who do you think he was showing this to? And forgive me, I forgot what the scale was, if you mentioned it. And then also, how would the notion of him physically painting this match with ideas of who was a gentleman? Because I know that over time, you weren't a gentleman if you painted, because you were working with your hands. And so how would he reconcile that with his ideas of being a gentleman?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very fair point. Well, I mean, I think, you know, I take it that he was pretty lonely and on his own, and he was looking for some way of projecting himself beyond what seems to be in a very small circle of you know, presumably the people he was teaching. And it may not, I mean, my guess is it wasn't necessarily a particularly successful school either. But I think you're quite right. I mean, of course, there's this whole thing of the paragoni, goes back to the Italian Renaissance, where the painter, you know, claims superiority over the sculptor because he can dress like a gentleman without messing up his garments, whereas a sculptor gets dust over everything and is clearly a laborer. So that is, so painters did often manage to at least assert their status. And Joshua Reynolds, for instance, that was his whole you know, point of his existence really, was to, you know, raise painting into being a profession. And that was already around at that time, I think. But it is, even so, it is an issue for someone like that, I think, in that kind of society, to want to, you know, not spoil his reputation by doing something that would have been seen as demeaning. So it is a problem, and I don't have I mean, I just don't know the answer to that one really, but it's a very interesting point, I think. And I mean, you might think, well, probably got some, you know, practitioner or laborer to do all the work for him while he stood there and said, you know, do this, do that. I mean, that would actually not make any difference to my argument, because I'm used to that, you know, for paintings. I mean, that's what Leonardo did, and probably Rembrandt as well, you know, wandered around saying, do that, or did a scrap on a piece of paper and said, you know, make a painting of this, and then put his name on it afterwards. You know, certainly if you see his authorship as being within the context of what might have been a small workshop where you might have had one or two helpers, that's always possible, yes. And that wouldn't have been demeaning to him. But it is a very fair point, yes.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question, or is someone else ahead of me in the queue?
No, please go ahead.
David, I had to step away, I'm sorry, but why would someone who could paint the furniture so expertly not have painted him so expertly?
Oh, well,
I missed that in your explanation, right?
Okay, well, I think that very simply, I mean, painting a figure consistently and convincingly is, you know, much harder business to do. You've got to articulate the figure, you've got to make the clothes sit right, you've got to make them look as if they're, you know, both, you know, firm and yet flexible. I mean, this is the stuff of years of instruction for an artist. And if you look at the books at the time of instruction, it shows you how to paint hands. And there, you know, again, it's very difficult and requires a lot of time, a lot of training, and a lot of experience above all. And all of these things took years and years. But if you've got a book of perspective and you're trying to draw furniture, then you've really only got sharp angles and also circles as well, all of which are within the compass of perspective. So there you've got very straight, I mean, you can actually, I mean, if you're doing a checkerboard floor, I mean, you can use a ruler, you can even copy, even trace all of those on a surface. But a figure, I think, just requires, you know, a huge amount of specialized knowledge and practice. I mean, an art school training takes years, and it's the figure. I mean, that's what you do at art school is draw the figure, and it's you know, it's years of work to do it. And I think that's in a way the simple explanation to, you know, to draw a convincing hand is much more skilled than furniture.
Thank you. It's good to see Catherine Bindman in the room.
Oh,
we got the Bindman tribe.
Good.
Kristen, any other questions or comments?
I don't think so. I think we remain riveted by David's presentation. Thank you.
No, it's brilliant. It's such a stunningly brilliant insight, David. And I think, oh, and as Henry Rosofsky, the great dean from Harvard, was fond of saying, and it has the added advantage of being true. Well, you know, or my father'd love to say, definition of friends is that you lie and I swear to it, right? So you published it and I'll endorse it. So it's it'll be a fact, right? But,
okay.
No, but you're doing for Williams what well, I've tried to do with Black writers in the 18th century, you know, with the trope of the talking book and the arts and sciences and absence of presence of reason, blah, blah, blah. And it's great because Williams starts it all off in that Hume, he starts off as a negation. He starts off, he's so important because in two principal texts, one in the body of philosophy, the Scottish Enlightenment, that's David Hume's second edition of National Characters of 1753. And then the primo text in the history of the justification of plantation slavery is Edward Long's multi-volume history of Jamaica. He appears as to be negated. And that really is a sign of power. I mean, he's an absent presence. It's astonishing, really. They were obsessed with refuting him. I mean, they wanted to kill him off.
Yes.
Without allowing him to speak. It's, well, Hume gives and takes, I mean, not Hume, Long gives and takes away. He presents his poem and ironically preserves it in the act of refuting it, right? Hume doesn't even do that. He just compares him with being like a parrot who speaks a few words plainly. But he was he was the talk of London in the 1740s. You know, what is, that's why he was on Hume's mind. So yeah. Anyway, but brilliant presentation. That's all I'm saying. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Terrific questions too.